Caitlin Dewey. Hello, Caitlin. Come out and bring your panel out. Let me tell you about Caitlin Dewey. About 2 years ago, Caitlin Dewey read a book called Omnivore's Dilemma. Anybody else read that? Yep. Okay, very good. Thank you, Earthman. By Michael Pollan. And she said, I know it's really cliched, but when I read that book, then I decided that I really wanted to be on the food beat. And then she saw a job, and she said, I'm really qualified because I've read this book. And here she is, moderating a panel. Good job, Caitlin.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. I have the great honor of being on stage with 4 very distinguished panelists this morning for what I'm sure will be a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation on the critical path to sustainability. I will start right next to me here. We have Parmesh Shah, who is the global lead for rural livelihoods and agricultural jobs at the World Bank. Beside him, we have Tanya Havman, the director and founder of Clar Mondial. Did I say your last name right? Beside her, we have Gawain Kripke. He is the policy director at Oxfam America. And last but certainly not least, we have Joy Basu, who is the food and agriculture lead at the RISE Fund. So Joy, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you tell us what the RISE Fund is?
Of course, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation. The RISE Fund is a private equity fund that we built at TPG to invest in for-profit businesses that, in addition to delivering a competitive financial return, also deliver measurable social and environmental impact. And the way that we define that is twofold. One, that there is independent research that verifies that impact of the outputs or the goods and services. So we try to be very, very evidence-based about our definition of impact. And second of all, that we can actually measure that over time and over the hold period that we as a private equity investor are partnering with the company.
Could you tell us what kind of projects you're working on right now, or something exciting that you like to tell people about?
Yeah, I think what makes RISE distinct is we've really built on the track record of other impact investment funds around the world that have shown that financial return and societal return don't need to be in contest, that they can actually be reinforcing. And we've built that into TPG's network so that we can actually use the capabilities, the skills, the footprint that TPG has wielded for its highly profitable companies to those entrepreneurs who are trying to address the SDGs. And so I think what I love talking about is how do you, instead of thinking just about the tools of agriculture, how do you use agriculture as a tool? I'm preaching to the choir here and believing it's the best lever we have to end extreme and chronic poverty. And it was Elizabeth from Abbott who spoke earlier about their dairy investments in India, and our first agriculture deal was very similar. It was a $50 million check into Dodla Dairy, which is a smallholder dairy in South India sourcing from 250,000 smallholders. And to this room, smallholder dairy and the impact there isn't new. I think what's really exciting, though, is being able to pull the likes of TPG into that investment and really seeing it as a commercial opportunity to meet the needs and the demands of this vibrant consumer class in India that's growing, and also use that to harness kind of the needs and the tools and the ingenuity of smallholders who haven't necessarily had the same benefits. And so I'd say what's exciting for me is using the theories of change, which are so well known in this room, and really translating them to investment themes in boardrooms that may never have heard of a smallholder before.
It's really fascinating. Tanya, I'm going to ask you a similar question. You lead Clar Mondial. It's an independent investment advisory company focused on sustainability, right? And you decided to start a food securities fund. What kinds of things are you working on with that?
So the Food Securities Fund is looking at a different asset class than the RISE Fund. So the Food Securities Fund is more of a fixed income-like fund. So we've been doing a lot of work over the past couple of years on climate bonds and green bonds, and we see that the total capital pool that's available in sort of more of the debt capital markets is quite significant, and the returns that investors are getting on that asset class in Europe and the US is relatively low, and we thought there was maybe an opportunity to try to package that into a new non-bank financial instrument or company that is able to look at risk-adjusted returns and risk in agricultural systems in different ways in order to promote sustainable agriculture in emerging markets, and particular more inclusive agriculture in value chains that is sort of committed to also regularly reporting on social and environmental issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Gawain, can I bring you in here? Oxfam runs a very cool consumer-facing project called Beyond the Brands, which helps consumers better understand what their favorite brands are doing in their supply chains. How did that work begin? How did Oxfam become involved in that?
Oxfam is involved in more than 90 countries around the world, and we're on the ground in rural communities. We often work with rural women's groups, farmers groups, and organizations. Beyond the Brands is, and that's a core commitment and Oxfam has done for many decades, but Beyond the Brands is an effort by Oxfam to step back and say, we need to look at the global food system more broadly. Food system that encompasses something like 7 billion food consumers and something like 2.5 billion food producers, and recognize that it's hard to have systemic impact working community by community, farm by farm. And so trying to do a bit of a systems think about how do we have systemic impact across the food system. And to do that, when you take systems thinking, you look for choke points or leverage points in the system. And the food companies are that. They control massive fractions of the global food supply and therefore have, and many of these supply chains are quite concentrated in food companies, which can be a bad thing, but also provides a lot of leverage if you're trying to make change. And so the Behind the Brands campaign is something that we developed to try to target the 10 biggest food companies and make them better actors for the goals of reducing poverty, gender equity, and so forth. So we launched it a few years ago to try to take advantage of the leverage that these food companies have to make things better.
And how are brands responding to your assessments? I know I looked up Cheerios' score this morning. It was quite poor.
Yeah, we've been very engaged with the companies directly. We launched the campaign by setting out an index, a scorecard basically, of how these 10 companies are faring on several indicators. The indicators we chose were land rights, gender and women, farmers' inclusion, workers, climate change, transparency, and water. And there are many others that people can include, but these were the ones that Oxfam decided we could try to make a change on. And I'll be honest that some of our engagement was sort of hostile. We were saying that they should be doing better. But the response has actually been quite positive, I would say. I'm not sure the companies enjoyed the experience, but in the end, a lot of them have made very important new commitments to do better. And what you find is most of these food companies, and I would say most people involved in food and agriculture, see themselves as the good guys and want to do better. And so a little prodding and maybe some ideas can really make a big difference. And so we've worked with the companies, gotten some pretty big commitments, and now we're sort of in implementation and follow-up phase for a lot of these commitments.
Transformation isn't always easy, right? Parmesh, let me ask you to bring this full circle for us. You lead the Rural Livelihoods and Agricultural Jobs work at the World Bank. Can you tell us what needs to happen to support flourishing new job opportunities in rural areas and low-income countries specifically?
I think we have almost like 500 million small farmers in the world, and we have about 500 large agribusiness companies. The middle is where the investment has not been made. The enterprise intensity in agriculture is the lowest among most of the sectors. And that number, if it has to go up, we have to invest differently. I think we have started now looking at investing in enterprise ecosystems at the lower level so that a lot of micro entrepreneurs who are in agriculture can graduate and become small and medium. Like, we don't have enough million-dollar companies in the egg space at all. And the young people don't need a sort of a traditional way of financing. They need incubation and acceleration and some kind of a way by which replicates some elements of what's happened in the IT industry now in the agriculture space. And we are looking at disruptive technologies and all to make the youth more excited about agriculture because they don't get excited by the same things as their fathers. An average age of farmers in Africa is 65. And I don't think that economy will convert into enterprise economy easily. But if we really develop the enterprise and incubator system, so we are working with a number of young entrepreneurs from Africa, Asia, and all places, and even working with large companies who have the enterprise ecosystem thinking, including the large e-commerce companies, and seeing whether we can disrupt that whole enterprise ecosystem in the egg and the food space differently. So I think our focus is now going to be more on the enterprise ecosystem and really invest in that, as opposed to just working with some farmers and some large companies.
Can you give us some examples of what sorts of investments the World Bank is making, specifically in youth? That's interesting.
So we are now, every project now which we are going to do in the next round of IDA 18 and 19, which is our next financing round, will have a component on ecosystem entrepreneurship. And we will invite a lot of young guys with ideas into what you call it, ideating, how we can solve, for example, a problem of stagnant mechanization in Africa. And so we have now companies like Hello Tractor, which are Uberizing the whole mechanization and taking the shared economy concepts from an urban market to a rural market and trying to do this in fintech, trying to do this in other areas there. So we have about 50 to 100 entrepreneurs who are really solving this problem very differently, and we are financing this as part of every program we do. Of course, we have not done this on a large scale yet. There is a lot of risk perceived because of every 3 companies which submit to fail. And what we have not yet reconciled is the risk framework, which you will have to develop that. But I think there are a lot of investments being made now, and I would say that the results are going to become much more clearer as we go forward.
Yeah. I'd like to kind of widen what you were saying there and bring everyone in. I would be curious what all of the panelists think about this idea of what needs to be done to help investors find more promising companies and young entrepreneurs in the agriculture space. Joy, I see you nodding. You want to kick us off?
I'd be happy to. I think it's an easy and a difficult answer all at once. And to those who are newer in the space, including the RISE Fund, I think one mantra I like to repeat is that, hunger is a very solvable problem, and that's why it's so frustrating. But that doesn't mean that the solutions are easy or obvious. And so I think we need to be very thoughtful as well. When it comes to increasing investable opportunities amongst young people, I hope that all of us in this room, myself included, listen as passionately as we speak. I hope we, to what Gail was saying earlier, increase opportunities for resilience, whether that's in the financial and physical infrastructure of what happens when a crop fails or your business fails, and having that fallback to culturally making it more okay to fail. Being a voice of Silicon Valley today, I'd say that's one of the most remarkable things is things like FailCon and failure in the Valley being glorified in some ways as a testament or a badge of honor. And I'd say the third thing is really transferring knowledge of what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past, and ensuring that we can create a stage and a platform for fresh thinking that entrepreneurs bring without remaking the mistakes or kind of going around the wheel all over again. So whether that's individuals in this room who've had a lot of experience taking board roles and actually mentoring in terms of how do you teach the hardcore business skills that Linda was talking about earlier, but doing so in a way that's not, hey, I know the answer here, but this is my experience, and let me sit on your board or let me take a small equity stake and actually try to partner with you in unleashing what solution you have for your own community.
Mm-hmm. Can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
I mean, I completely agree, and I think we need to look at it's both a supply and demand problem. I think what's exciting is that there are increasing new ways for entrepreneurs and businesses to access finance, but these are not really very well regulated yet. I think there are being sort of more and more moves to sort of include them in global financial systems. But I think we also all as a community have an obligation to try to push the points that we have to both the debt capital markets, the equity capital markets, and other sources to sort of push investment advisors, wealth managers, banks to actually look and pick out specific products that also are committed to impact. So I think it's great that you're working with UBS and groups like that. And I think the more that all of us sort of call up our bank and ask, what sort of impactful or sustainable savings products do you offer, and actually proactively putting our money in that is really important. I think also regulation then at a country level is quite important as well in terms of being able to sort of allow both domestic and inward investment. And then I think in terms of the entrepreneurs and businesses themselves, I think just more mentorship and support to sort of professionalize a lot of those. I know that the World Bank, for instance, through its climate innovation centers is providing a lot of support, but that kind of thing also really needs to upscale. And then giving, as Joy mentioned, more of a platform to those young entrepreneurs to help them be exposed to other types of investors. So.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about what the World Bank is doing in this space?
I think, as she was also saying, that we have taken certain areas like climate, agribusiness, and also food systems kind of entrepreneurship as an area where we would fund a lot of innovation and incubation there. But we also feel that we have to also work this within the educational system which is there. So all the higher education projects which we are now funding, like in West Africa, we're going to make a $200 million investment in higher education, which will have a strong incubation element built into the curriculum of the top West African kind of institutions where the most people are coming from. So I think we have to not only have an enclave kind of systems, but really we're going to invest now in the education sector differently. Because unless that incubation is inbuilt into the thinking of these institutions, the pipeline will come from there, and then the pipeline for the investments which others are doing will become bigger. And the second thing is the kinds of financial products which you have to develop is that we are working with governments on how to work on more venture capital kind of markets, at the policy level. Since we work at the policy level with many governments, we are asking them to create space for those kinds of investment to happen. So if there are investors coming in who want to go into this space, the regulation and all needs to be different from what it is there. And some kind of an incentive structure which allows some kind of incentives for creating youth jobs. So if we don't calibrate and measure this and don't have policy instruments which link with that, then it's going to be more difficult to do it. So, but I strongly believe that if we have higher education bringing incubation from day one, then I think we will create a really robust pipeline of investment for future for the kinds of things which are being done by a lot of panelists here and the kinds of funds which are coming from the social impact investing space. We don't have a robust pipeline because we don't have a robust educational system which really creates that kind of pipeline and encourages that kind of thinking.
I'm glad you mentioned jobs, because I'd like to talk a little bit about the labor market in some of the places where you work. Much of the employment opportunity in low and middle income countries is in the informal economy, in the informal sector, and may be difficult to retain. So I'm curious, are there prospects for more formal employment in the near future, or does the future of work simply not look like that?
Projections are showing that Africa will not go through the same manufacturing economy which the Asia went through. This is assessments being done by a lot of people. And I think the shared and the service economy will become a bigger driver of things. And that also the digital disruption in that will happen at a faster rate. So I don't think they will follow the same formal economy shape. That's why increasing opportunities for entrepreneurship for young people, as opposed to looking for jobs, traditional jobs the way the jobs were earlier, are going to be limited. So I think we have to create very different ways of creating labor markets, which has to be more to do with shared and service economy. And we are seeing that trend already, that when you see the jobs in manufacturing, they are not growing at the rate at which they were growing earlier. I'm not saying that manufacturing will not happen, but it will not happen in the same way as it happened earlier. So I think we have to be really looking at the way we are looking at labor market skills, incubation, very differently than we have looked at.
Gawain, would you agree with that? I know you guys do a lot of work with the...
Yeah, I mean, countries that are poor now are likely to develop in ways that are different than countries that have emerge from poverty. I think that's true, but I wouldn't undervalue the importance of jobs, formal salaried jobs, as a goal and as a route out of poverty. And I think the agriculture and food sector is one of the areas where you can say that there are jobs to be had if you can support the investors and the small businesses to grow. There's this growing literature about agriculture transformation that has many sources, but there's a critical mass that emerges, and a lot of the growth happens not in the capital cities, but in secondary cities, and it's concurrent with urbanization, but also with changing food tastes, and there's a lot of opportunity, I think, especially for younger people to pick up enterprises and make jobs out of it. So I do think that is where we should be focusing a lot of attention. And while entrepreneurship, I mean, it will start with entrepreneurship, but we want jobs out of it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. And I would just add that with 15 to 20 million new jobs needed a year on the African continent, we can't afford for the answer to be one or the other. It has to be both. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record and giving an example from Silicon Valley, as I look at the gig economy now, I think we're a little bit binary in the way we think about formal versus informal jobs and the linearity of that, right? We're going back to people, ride sharing and working for themselves and figuring out how to have a portfolio job. And that's not the right approach for everybody, but I do think it can be really empowering. And it has been in the US, and we forget that that's how a lot of non-US workers kind of gain their skills and gain their income. That being said, as an investor, seeing an individual who has had experience in the formal sector, whether that's training at a multinational corporation and kind of gone back to their hometown, is a really strong sign of somebody who has business skills that they can then apply. So I don't mean to say it's one or the other, but I do think it's both, and we need to be flexible in the way that we differentiate those, because it's not one or the other.
Can I also add something? I mean, I think as someone who is an entrepreneur myself, I feel incredibly fortunate that I live in Switzerland and that I'm European, and that starting a business isn't a huge, huge risk to me and my life and my family. And I think that not only the political system, but also the work that you do is incredibly important in actually then creating sustained and responsible demand through those agriculture value chains to let people become entrepreneurs in a way that allows them to have predictable livelihoods.
Let's talk about supply chains for a moment. I'm curious if the four of you have seen the emergence of any sort of common standards or platforms for partnership among private sector players that are driving more sustainable and inclusive supply chains.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure you could talk about this as well, but so we're looking to sort of work through larger corporate supply chains as well, and we are seeing that there's definitely a pressure on larger corporates, on both traders, consumer-facing goods companies, in trying to be more responsible in terms of the supply chain. It's not coming only from a social issue, but also things like deforestation-free and the environmental footprint of agriculture, and also from a food health and safety standards. I think that in Europe as well in the US, we've had some quite big cases of sort of disgusting product entering into a market where it shouldn't, and I think that all those kind of things are driving more transparency in value chains and requiring companies not only to sort of focus on that more, but also work together across different stakeholders and across different parts of the supply chain. So I think that's a really positive trend. However, I think what has been a bit challenging is those large corporates, yes, they may want to do it, but they are also limited in their ability to do so, for instance, by their shareholding structure. So the investors that invest in them may not want them to put aside a large chunk of funding, for instance, for pre-financing.
Oh, just quickly, I mean, through our Behind the Brands campaign, we saw many of the food companies that we were targeting really want to act to improve their own supply chains, but also recognizing that a lot of these are sectoral issues. And in some ways trying to make competition on things like human rights or land grabs or workers' rights sort of a pre-competitive issue. They don't want to compete on destroying the environment. They want to compete in other ways. And if they can take sectoral actions, that can improve everybody. So you see it in cocoa, where the biggest cocoa companies have come together to try to cooperate in developing the cocoa sector, working with farmers, working to improve gender within their supply chains. You see it in palm oil, where there's the roundtable to try to improve standards and make deforestation sort of a pre-competitive issue, so they're not competing on deforestation. So there's a lot of positives in it. I think it's spotty. You don't see it in every supply chain, in every sector, and so we really need a lot more. But I think there's some encouraging instances where that's happened.
I think it was, you had mentioned this earlier, but there's obviously threats in having a very concentrated food system the way that we do, but it also offers opportunities for leverage in that if a few players start acting differently, right, you can see massive change. Right. One thing I tell entrepreneurs who I meet, in the US, you'll see a lot of entrepreneurs in the food space who only see the food companies as potential acquirers of theirs. But whether it's in the US or around the world, partnering with large food companies as customers can be a really empowering way to meet the needs of your local community and also find a product that has commercial scale. And so the Chicago Council's report highlights a couple companies like Farmerline or Cellulant that really serve some of these big food companies, but they do so in a way that is very mindful of what smallholders need and in a very innovative way, using things like blockchain or just the mobile payment infrastructure to reimagine the way that our supply chains work. And I think that there's a lot more possibility there. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for individuals like Paul Pullman at Unilever who are trying to do the right thing. And I think we as shareholders of companies like that need to reward that behavior and speak with our dollars as well.
And I think, other sort of examples are, I think other groups like, for instance, World Food Programme, who are trying to align their supply chain and trying to buy more from local farmers, are really exciting. And I think, US groups like USAID and the Bureau for Food Securities has also supported a lot of those initiatives. So I think that's also important that sort of non-private sector actors also have a role to play. Mm.
Just add one point on this is that we are trying to now develop a kind of alliance on youth employment across many companies and coming with some kind of standards. It's a program just launched 3 years back. And I think there are many private companies, there are a lot of other people also involved in that, and they will come with some kind of guidelines on youth employment, which will be hopefully converted into standards. More difficult to do it when you come to jobs as opposed to environment and food safety. But I think there's an attempt right now happening that everyone should be making some commitments towards jobs, particularly for youth, as part of your social and standards as well as business standards.
We'll look forward to seeing those develop. I think we're going to take a couple quick questions now. We don't have too much time left, but I see we have a question from the audience here. It says, many financial benchmarks and investors' expectations are set by unsustainable businesses. How do you reset those expectations?
I'm happy to go first. So we're definitely seeing this. It's been very interesting. So fundraising for this fund, especially on a product that's more of a fixed income product, because we see that returns are so low, in particular in Europe, that I think investors are more mainstream investors are willing to consider other types of products than they maybe would have because they are looking for return. I think maybe that'll change as macro environment changes. I think what has been interesting sort of discussions to have has been in terms of what is a comparative return to look at for financial products, and also how they look at risk-adjusted returns. Unfortunately, I think the discussion is oftentimes on an absolute return basis, and I would love to see sort of more integration of investors on different types of risks when considering returns. So I think, unfortunately, we're just going to have to see more good quality impact products come to the table, all different types of products, to show investors that these are comparable products on a risk-adjusted return basis, that they can be relatively stable in their performance, that they are additive to a portfolio, that maybe they're uncorrelated with other assets. But all these are things that have to be tested, and I think that's why we need to also actually proactively be developing new types of products and also working with regulators and other types of groups to sort of shine a spotlight on the risks that are inherent in some financial products that aren't really talked about.
I agree with what Tanya said, and I would also add this is, I think, a really important question, especially now in the financial cycle. We're seeing a lot of companies that are attracting, headlines and headline prices, but their fundamental business economics aren't there, and that's, as true in the U.S. as it is anywhere else. I'll go back to something that a few entrepreneurs said earlier, which is it comes back to, I think, revenue and actually looking at what the customer experience is. So if you can't have someone buy this product repeatedly because they see value in it, that's a long-term and unsustainable business. And so I think really going to the customer experience and the unit economics of a particular product is really, really important. And where the Rise Fund sits, we try to do growth stage equity, so somewhere around a Series C. And I think that's one of the most important metrics I look for in order to determine if this business is really scalable, is what's happening with the unit economics. And it's something that, is critical if we're going to be financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable.
I think the perception of risk has to change. When we do these things, they can't be done through traditional kind of investments. The risk definition for an institution like World Bank, which has a AAA rating on the bond market, and then it goes into something like that and things don't work, then it becomes very complex. So I think we have to be very innovative in coming out with new kinds of business products, as Tanya is also saying, and I think Joy is also saying that we need to be more creative in terms of coming with new ways of investment. There are socially responsible investors, there are different kinds of investors, categories emerging. And then the domestic market is so big, whether it's Asia or Africa, and that has not been taken in for these kinds of investments. The domestic investments are not being made into these kinds of things. Social entrepreneurship is definitely growing, but that domestic market recalibration is very, very important to get a lot of local resources to be devoted to that. Because the international investment can spur it, but it cannot scale it up. We need to think of a different model to do that. We also need to borrow something from the way, at the risk of repeating that, Silicon Valley has done some things in a different way for more difficult risk environments. I think agriculture food is inherently more risky than technology, but it's not that much more riskier than that. So we need to become more creative in bringing products which came from their early stage financing, incubators, some kind of joint equity, very good. And then we are working with governments on changing their financial systems to allow a domestic market to emerge for different kinds of products. But it's a long way to go.
Do we have any more questions in the audience? I don't know if there's a mic going around or... I see a gentleman over here.
Thanks again, Paul Miller, LWR. Gawain, you talked about the spotty enforcement of supply chain rules and regulations, even industry created or otherwise, and then perhaps the advantage and the disadvantages of a concentration of seed and pesticide companies. I guess Bayer Monsanto will be a quarter of the world's supply of seeds and pesticides. So can you give us an example of how the concentration can help sustainability of supply chains, including the human rights and environment aspects, and situations in which concentration in the market can actually prevent or undermine those goals? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I certainly don't want to be trying to defend concentration in the food sector. In general, I think it's problematic, but it's also a reality, and so that's more the framing I have. I think it's quite a reasonable position to argue that it's has costs and that there are negatives to it. But the fact that there is concentration and that some players especially if they collaborate, can drive positive change into the food system. That's the hypothesis of our Behind the Brands campaign, which is not to argue in favor of concentration, but to say that if it exists, there might be some positives from it. And we do see that in some of these sectoral initiatives where companies are saying they want to do better. They see poor social or human rights or environmental performance in their supply chains as a negative for their business, and maybe also because maybe they care, and want to take actions to try to do better. Partly to the previous question, once you have some of the biggest companies saying we want to do better, then they start seeing competition from other players who aren't doing better as a problem. And then they're trying to raise industry standards, and you begin to get to thinking about the role of the public sector in terms of regulating or enforcement of standards. So there's an evolution of this that I think can be a positive sort of race to the top. But I want to be careful not to say that I think that concentration in input suppliers, for example, is going to be a good thing.
It's just a silver lining, that's all.
Maybe.
All right, well, that's a great note to end on. I think that's about all the time we have. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to all of you for listening as well.
Thank you.